You're listening to Think Deep,
a podcast by the Deep-Ocean Stewardship Initiative.
We are a global network of experts
working at the intersection of science,
policy, and community
to guide stewardship of the deep ocean.
Through engagement with policymakers,
building global capacity,
and fostering collaboration.
Our core team and ambassadors
help shape policies that protect deep ocean ecosystems,
which are vital to sustaining life on Earth.
Join us as we dive into the science,
governance, and stories shaping the future of our ocean.
Hi everyone, and welcome to Think Deep, decoding deep ocean science and policy. In this podcast series, we'll take you behind the scenes to explore how scientific research influences decisions, laws, and protections for the deep ocean. Join us as we dive into the science, the challenges, and the people working toward a sustainable ocean future. I'm your host, Michelle Gurayev, an oceanographer with a passion for the deep ocean and its connection to our lives. Today, we will dive deep into the story of deep ocean governance with Professor Jon Copley, a deep ocean biologist and explorer who's been involved in ocean governance and research for years. Jon, welcome to the show.
Hi, Michelle. It's great to join you.
It's awesome to have you on the first episode of this series. And from what I know, you've had such a fascinating career in marine science and exploration. So what first sparked your interest in the deep ocean?
When I was a kid growing up, my dad used to get National Geographic magazine, and every so often they would have these maps of the ocean floor produced by Marie Tharp with Bruce Heason and Heinrich Baran. And I was fascinated by these maps because nothing on those maps was in anything I was learning at school. There was this kind of hidden world down there, this hidden landscape. There were all these places that had names down there. They were, crazy looking features. And I just wondered, what would it be like to visit those places? What's actually down there? What does it look like? What lives down there? And so I got fascinated in deep ocean exploration.
That's amazing. My parents had a lot of National Geographic magazines too, and they definitely sparked my curiosity about nature, especially wild animals. So Jon, what is deep ocean governance and why does it matter so much?
Well, first of all, in science, when we're talking about the deep ocean, we tend to be talking about things that are more than 200 meters deep. And that's for a couple of reasons. 200 meters is where there's certainly a change in the life in the deep ocean, because that's the limit at which there's bright enough sunlight for algae to grow. And so the kind of ocean life changes below that. And some places it's shallower than that, of course. When it comes to governance, 200 meters is kind of the depth at the edge of the continental shelf, the shallow seabed that fringes the land masses, where it starts to slope off into the deep ocean basins. And that's also then why governance is really important, because the bottom of that continental slope is usually what we regard as being potentially the limits of national jurisdiction. And then most of the ocean is deep ocean and it's beyond that. And so governance then, we're talking about something that is beyond national boundaries, and that requires nations coming together to talk about how to manage activities in that space.
So just to sum that up, 200 meters is where the ocean really starts to change, both in terms of sunlight and life, and it's also where the seafloor begins to drop off into deeper waters that often fall outside of any one country's laws. And are there any misconceptions about ocean governance that stand out to you?
A lot of people say, it's like a Wild West out there. There isn't any governance and anyone can do whatever they like. Regulation and enforcement of regulation undoubtedly has its challenges out in the ocean. But there is a well-established framework of governance for most of the human activities that take place in the ocean. Often they're regulated in different ways by different bodies. And of course, it's always evolving and developing. And it's being developed multilaterally by nations coming together under treaties, under conventions.
Yeah, so it's definitely not a black and white process.
54% actually of the surface of our planet that is ocean beyond any boundaries of national jurisdictions. So absolutely right. In a sense, it doesn't belong to any one nation. We all have responsibility for its stewardship, and that's the real challenge of ocean governance.
So when we say areas beyond national jurisdiction, we're referring to the parts of the ocean that do not belong to any one country, correct?
Yeah.
And can you tell us a bit more about why it's so tricky to govern these areas?
It's a very tricky thing to govern for lots of different reasons. First of all, you've got all the different interests that are involved in activities. Some of these activities are really important for the economics of countries, and so they have a real vested interest in seeing that those activities are protected and can continue in a sustainable fashion. There's also that big challenge of what we call the crisis of the common. When nothing is owned by anyone in particular, but we all kind of benefit from it, then who kind of has the say as to whether something should go ahead in one particular way or it shouldn't go ahead, or it should go ahead in a different way, because it's not under a single jurisdiction. And that's why there are these many bodies focusing on particular resources, and inevitably they are multilateral. There are lots of countries and other stakeholders involved in making sure that their perspectives are considered and represented, and that takes a huge amount of time and effort. And of course, the really big one is the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea, or UNCLOS.
So UNCLOS is basically the main international agreement that sets the rules for how countries use the oceans.
Yeah, this took many years. It's a phenomenal achievement for UNCLOS to come into existence and so many nations to actually ultimately say, yes, all right, we subscribe to this. We agree this is the way forward for how we govern activities in this space.
And considering how complex ocean governance is, it's impressive that countries were able to come together around something this ambitious.
I think is actually a bit of a story of hope, that out of all the other things that were going on in the 20th century, this actually came to pass.
And can you give us a bit of context? It was finalized in 1982, correct?
1982 is when the treaty was finalized, but the negotiations leading up to that took a lot longer.
When did they start?
So it actually started several decades before. There was a sort of an initial meeting of potential parties to talk about what do we do in this space that's beyond national jurisdictions. Then there was a second conference. And then in 1973, that's when the third conference on the law of the sea started. And those discussions lasted from 1973 until 1982. So that's 9 years of discussion and negotiations.
And alongside these negotiations, there were also some really foundational ideas starting to take shape about how this space should be managed, right?
This ocean space doesn't belong to any one nation. So with activities that take place there, the big question is who benefits? And a really important principle that is at the heart of UNCLOS, UN Convention on the Law of the Sea, is that what's in that space is regarded as common heritage. Back then, when they were negotiating this thing, they called it common heritage of mankind. Now, of course, more properly, we call it common heritage of humankind, or common heritage of humanity. But that's a really important principle that was recognized as the heart of UNCLOS.
How did that come about?
That came about before those negotiations began. So actually, November 1967, there's an ambassador representing Malta at the UN General Assembly in New York called Arvid Pardo, and he gave an incredibly eloquent speech. He'd found out about the potential mineral wealth on the ocean floor and so on, potentially having minerals of value for technological and economic development. And he realized the countries that are already technologically advanced would be the ones out there grabbing these resources and increasing inequality between nations. He came up with the idea that actually that potential mineral wealth of the deep ocean could be used to address past injustices. It could be, if it's recognized as common heritage, then the benefits could be shared, if you like, and it could lift some nations out of poverty through technological development, and it could create a more equitable global society of nations. And then 3 years later, in 1970, another meeting of the General Assembly of the United Nations actually adopted the principle of common heritage. And then that became one of the founding principles behind UNCLOS when they got into the UNCLOS negotiations from 1973 onwards.
So the principle of common heritage really highlights that this isn't just about national interests, but about all of humanity. It's a reminder of how global and interconnected ocean governance has to be. So mineral wealth drove a lot of this conversation then?
Very much so. In his speech, Arvid Pardo lays out two choices. We can go down the path that we already know, where it's a gold rush. The nations that are already in an advantageous position will be the ones that do best, and it will increase inequality. And then he presented this other vision for, well, we could look at doing things differently.
And all of this was being discussed before we had a clear understanding of what's actually down there.
Of course, this was 1967, he gave his speech. We didn't know very much about the environment down there. We didn't know much about the ecology. We didn't understand much about how the kind of whole Earth-ocean system works and the importance of that for regulating our climate and a lot of other things. So environmental impacts weren't really on the radar like they are now, because our knowledge of the deep ocean and its ecology in particular was much less back then. And that's something that obviously has evolved as the sort of framework for any regulation of any activity.
With all that in mind, science plays a critical role in creating baselines, or the crucial information that we need in order to be able to make decisions about extraction or resource use. But can you tell us more about how scientific research really influences policy and governance?
Science plays a critical role. It's one of the aspects. So I'll give you an example that illustrates that. I'm involved in a project. It's based and led here in the UK to understand nodule mining impacts. It involves 7 research institutions across the UK and 3 international institutions as well. And we published a paper that showed, we're talking about a 6 million square kilometre area of the Eastern Pacific here, running kind of from coast of Mexico and so on out past south of Hawaii. And the seabed across there, it slopes very gently from about 4,000 metres to nearly 6,000 metres across 5,000 kilometres east to west. It slopes very gently, but it does get deeper as you head out to the west. And what we were able to show was there's actually a fundamental change in the kind of marine life living on the seafloor, pretty much halfway across it. And that's actually where the seabed passes a critical depth, where there's a change in seawater chemistry, and that then favours the kinds of skeletons that animals can grow. And so we get soft body things living deeper. We get things with kind of what we call carbonate skeletons living shallower, dominating. So there's this pretty fundamental change in marine life. And it's really important to know that, because then it's like, well, there are these protected areas that have been set up. How representative are they of that variation that we found? How is it going to change in future? Because that critical depth is actually going to get shallower with climate change and ocean acidification. But getting the data to show that large scale pattern, that required piecing together observations from 20 expeditions across the whole 6 million square kilometre area.
Wow.
Huge regional scale research effort, international, and actually a lot of that data came from the contractors, who are out there doing what we call currently exploration license activities as part of the International Seabed Authority, and they get their environmental baseline data and they share it, and the ISA is producing a database of what's out there. And it's having all of that coordinated effort allows us to get this large-scale understanding of the patterns of life. That's what we need for successful governance. And my big worry is any nation going it alone, and individual contractors will have to do their own impact assessments for the little areas that they're going to be operating in. But there isn't this joined-up, coordinated framework, which the International Seabed Authority has produced as it's evolved. And it's going to be very hard to answer that big question about cumulative impact and where that could tip over into serious harm and how that needs to be avoided.
Right. For those of you who might be wondering, 20 expeditions might be more than 20 years, right? It's years of research. It's years of exploration, of scientists going out there on ships and doing so much work.
And it's a huge investment. And so it's expensive research to get ships out there. And it makes sense that we join up our efforts, that we're not, chasing the same goals scientifically, that instead we pool our resources, and we can achieve far more when we do that through that international coordination. And that's the kind of thing that's required with all this research out in that ocean space.
So on a more personal note, Jon, you've been working in this field for so many years. And you've been exploring the deep ocean firsthand and pushing for its protection, for its understanding. So what does ocean governance mean to you personally? How has it influenced your career and your perspective on the deep sea?
Well, when I started my career, ocean governance wasn't as recognised as it is now. So my first ever expedition was actually 1994. So it was the same year that the International Seabed Authority came into being and, UNCLOS came into effect. In the early part of my career, the science I was doing was very much pure science. It was about finding out what was happening in this part of our world. And it was very much kind of pure research. There wasn't a particular application, but it was fascinating fundamental research looking at adaptations of life to different conditions that we get in different deep ocean habitats. But that has utterly changed in the 31 years now that I've been doing it. There's such a strong driver now to understand our impacts on deep ocean ecosystems, and therefore how we can make more informed choices about human activities that affect the deep ocean. That's at the heart of science's involvement in ocean governance, is being able to bring that evidence and get it across to people so that they can make informed choices about regulation and so on, and the consequences of the impacts that we're having. So that's been the big change. So for me, ocean governance, it's an opportunity to exercise our stewardship of the deep ocean. I think at some point we need to be demonstrating that we can make responsible choices in how we live in our natural world, how we use its resources, how we regard biodiversity and our connection to it, how we value it. And I mean that not just in an economic sense, I mean that in terms of our values, how we live on this planet and how we are going to carry on living on this planet.
I love that so much.
Deep ocean governance is an opportunity, I hope, for us to kind of demonstrate that we can do this.
Amazing. That's an incredible trajectory. I was born in 1994, so you've literally been exploring the ocean for my entire time on this planet. It brings so many questions up for me as an early career ocean scientist. I just want to ask you, what have you seen in the ocean? Like, what are some of the most fascinating things you've seen in the ocean? And was it very different 30 years ago to what it is now to go on an expedition?
Okay, those are some great questions. Every expedition is different, even now. And that's actually something that I really love. Because it's international, you get to go on the research ships of lots of different nations, and each one has its own culture. But that's always a really fascinating experience. And yet, there is a shared culture across all expeditions. And the thing that unites us is because we're all on board to explore these environments. And we get to see things for the first time. And those are the special moments. I can remember being on an expedition where we were looking for the world's deepest hydrothermal vents, hot springs on the ocean floor. And a previous expedition had found good signs that they were in the area, and we had the vehicles to actually get down there and explore the seafloor and find these things, and we were hunting around for them. Eventually, we came across them. We had no idea what was going to be living at them. Well, we had some guesses. When we found these things and we saw what was living there were tears throughout the control center on this research ship. And as scientists, we often don't agree about our interpretations of data and, all this kind of thing. But in those moments, we are united in wonder at the world that we are exploring. And to share that.
Wow, that's incredibly moving. And it's amazing to hear about those moments of discovery. And while you've witnessed some truly incredible sights in the deep ocean, I'm imagining there's also been a growing awareness of the human footprint in these remote places. Have you seen that shift firsthand as well?
Yeah, pretty much everywhere I've been, I have seen human impact. And often these are places that we're seeing them for the first time as scientists, starting to explore and try and understand them. And yet the impacts of human activities have visible impacts of human activities have got there before we have. So, visible rubbish, trash, yeah, pretty much everywhere that I've worked.
This is why we need governance.
Exactly.
What your generation has learned, I guess, is this fair to say? It's literally, we need to take a different approach now that we've seen that there's effects on everything and the human impacts are everywhere.
Exactly.
How can we do this differently?
Yeah.
What do you think is in store for future ocean explorers?
Well, yeah, it's a great question. What's in store for future human explorers? There are two parts to it. Exploring the ocean as a scientist is always a bit like puzzle solving. There might be a particular aspect of the ocean we're interested in. I'm a biologist, so I'm interested in what lives where and why, broadly. And from knowing already what's living in lots of places and having some idea as to why that species is where it is, we can make some guesses as to the missing puzzle pieces that we haven't explored yet. And there are still missing puzzle pieces for us to understand. And it's very much about how species disperse and evolve in deep sea habitats. But then what's really exciting is when you're doing that, but you get a puzzle piece that absolutely doesn't fit with the rest of the pieces of your puzzle, or the pattern on that piece just totally doesn't match. And then you think, oh, actually, there's a bigger picture here that we weren't even aware of. But then a lot of the big leaps in ocean exploration have been the completely unexpected things where we just had no idea that this thing was possible, or that this thing existed, or that this process was taking place.
Like finding life in the deep ocean, right?
Yeah. Well, fundamentally, yes, finding life in the deep ocean. So the big surprises that we haven't anticipated, those are, of course, the really exciting ones. And I'm sure that they're out there. I can't predict what they're going to be by definition, but they're going to be out there, and we're going to find them if we keep exploring.
I love that idea, that the ocean still holds pieces of the puzzle we didn't even know were missing. So other than keeping an eye out for the unexpected, what else should future explorers be aware of, in your opinion?
Bringing in as many perspectives as possible. And this is something that I think we're able to do much better with the technology we have now. We still need to overcome barriers to accessibility, but deep ocean science is pretty expensive science, and consequently, it's not globally very representative at all. Now, we do have the technology now with expeditions to live stream, kind of like opening up the ocean, and people talk about democratizing deep sea science through these kinds of tools. And I think that's very important because not everybody can go to sea. And, we need as many perspectives as possible, particularly when it comes to science in this context of ocean governance. We need everybody to be able to be involved and share their perspectives. However, the tools themselves are still really expensive. Big ships, expensive deep diving vehicles. So there are also organizations that are working to develop kind of low cost tools for local communities, where the deep ocean is right on someone's doorstep, it's part of their world, they want to be able to explore it, then actually being able to do that. That's the kind of thing that I really hope spreads.
And beyond access, it feels like part of the challenge is helping people relate to the deep ocean, to see it as part of their everyday lives, not just something far away or abstract even.
You can go out at night and you can look up at the night sky and see the stars and wonder about space and so on, but you can't kind of glance at the deep sea in the same way.
Yeah.
I mean, right now, we're recording this podcast, we're using the deep ocean.
Amazing.
Because the way we're communicating is going across this network of fiber optic cables across the ocean floors. So we use the deep ocean every day without realizing it. That's just one way that we do it, and we're connected to it. And of course, there are many others as well.
Amazing. Wow. That blew my mind. Like, we're not even thinking about it. And every day we're using something that's related to the deep ocean. Incredible. So before we wrap up, we really hope that our listeners will now have a good grasp of the story of deep ocean governance. What do you hope listeners take away from today?
What I hope listeners take away is that deep ocean governance exists to enable our stewardship of the deep ocean. It's always developing, evolving, improving, and there are so many ways that we can get involved in that process to care for the stewardship of the oceans. Almost kind of like whatever our background is, and it's really important that all our perspectives are represented in that development and that process as well.
And speaking of involvement, what's the one thing people can do to get more involved in ocean governance?
Recognize the opportunities that there are for having your input. So that can come in lots of different ways. Here we are. This is, the Deep-Ocean Stewardship Initiative exists as a network of people around the world who have an interest in bringing whatever background perspective they have from their professional activity into deep ocean governance. So that's obviously an opportunity to do that. But there's lots of other ways as well. So nationally, even to local level, wherever there's something that is a connection to the deep ocean, then there's an opportunity to engage with whoever is involved in the governance of that activity at that level. Finding those ways to have an input and to make a connection, to start a conversation and to share your perspective, your evidence. That's often the challenge, but it is possible to do that. It could be your national elected representatives. If that's for the particular region where you live, then you have an opportunity to contact them where there's an issue that they might be debating. Or it could be local. It could be local communities. Here in the UK, we've got a movement now where local governments of kind of little towns can actually declare what they call a motion for the ocean, which is where they say, okay, in all our decision making now, we're going to recognise the importance of considering impacts on the ocean. And I think that's really positive. And that's come from people reaching out and developing this kind of thing and then encouraging local representatives to adopt it. We sometimes as individuals feel very isolated, and that maybe makes us feel like we can't bring about the change we might hope to see. But we're not alone. And if we can reach out to others, we can realize that and we can get things done.
That's amazing. It definitely makes me feel like we're empowered as a society and as individuals and as groups of people. Thank you so much, Jon, for such an insightful and truly inspiring conversation. You've really helped us connect the dots between science, policy, and, very importantly, our shared responsibility for the ocean.
It's an absolute pleasure, Michelle. Thank you for having me as a guest.
And to our listeners, thank you for tuning in. We hope today's episode gave you a clearer understanding of deep ocean governance and why it matters more than ever. In upcoming episodes, we'll dive deeper into the science and stories behind ocean conservation and explore how you can also help protect our blue planet. If you enjoyed this episode and would like to support our podcast, be sure to leave a rating, share, and hit subscribe. Plus, you can check out the links and resources in the show notes for more about DOSI, deep ocean governance, and how to get involved. Thank you to our funders, Arcadia, Synchronicity Earth, the Benioff Ocean Science Laboratory, and the University of Southampton for their support. Think Deep is produced by DOSI with support from David Benjamin Sound.